A somewhat different video today. I'll be discussing some fragrances that I've had for a very long time and some personal reminiscence on them and a little bit of history about the line and about my relationship to the line. So if you don't like story time, do click away. But I believe these fragrances have already been discussed to death and I don't have a lot to add in terms of reviewing them. So I thought I'll just talk a little bit about the history. Now, I did Google dates just to make sure I don't misspeak, but most of this is going from my own personal memory. So please do not take this as an airtight, researched history of fragrances. So we'll begin with what initiated the idea for this video, is that I wore Bois d'Argent a couple days ago, my old friend Bois d'Argent. As is often the case, some of the oldest fragrances in our wardrobe get neglected because we know them so well. Sometimes they can be stuck in time with nostalgia a little bit, reminding us too much of a certain period in our life that makes them difficult to wear again. First, I'll talk a little bit about the wear and the smell. I often think this was a precursor to the Dior Homme fragrance, which would come out shortly after. And in a way, it's like the couture high-end version of that. We get iris, we get a sweet honey note, we get myrrh and resins in the base. It also does have quite a prominent ambroxany, warm, molecular type dry down and character to it. I find that this one is a wafter. I've heard people complain of newer iterations being very light, but it must be said that no version of this was ever heavy or loud, but it's always been very long lasting. I also find that it changes its wear quite a bit depending on the weather. I can remember very acutely one day wearing it in summer and being just overwhelmed, finding it a bit cloying, especially the honey note. But the way it wore a couple days ago on a cool autumn day, I sprayed 3 sprays at first, and after a couple hours I thought maybe I want to reapply. I'm not smelling very much of it. But throughout the day, I got this nice kind of warm, wafting, elegant cloud. And then at night, as I was laying in bed, I still smelled it really pulsating off my warm skin. In the late dry down, I get a really beautiful, elegant soapiness, which I assume might be coming from the myrrh, because I find that sometimes resins, when they dry down, have this sort of soapy quality to them. It has a beautiful iris. The ambroxan to me is not overstated. It's not too much and cloying, but it definitely adds to that warm and sort of crowd-pleasing aspect to this one. I can imagine this one leaves quite a beautiful trail, and I have a funny memory of a friend who said he knew a friend who always smelled like this, and he just left a trail of Bois d'Argent everywhere he went, and I thought that was quite interesting. So something about this line that I suspected and confirmed with Googling dates is that it was, as far as I can find, the first designer exclusive line, launched under the creative direction of Hedi Slimane, who was designing Dior menswear at the time. It predates the Chanel Les Exclusives, which came out in 2007. The Dior, what's now called the Private line, came out in 2004, launched with 3 fragrances, which included Bois d'Argent, Noire, and Cologne Blanche, which I don't have. At the time, I was quite a big fashion fan and still am to this day, but I really loved the work of Hedi Slimane. It was cool, it was new, it was androgynous, it felt very of the moment. His skinny suits, his skinny jeans, back when regular guys wouldn't even consider putting on tight pants, Hedi made it cool, and we're still left with echoes of that today. Even though trends have moved towards the oversized right now, you still see the effect of kind of changing the comfort that men have with dressing in fitted clothes. It's fall, which means my throat is full of phlegm. I tend to get fall allergies, so I apologize for that. So anyway, Bois d'Argent predates Dior Homme, which came out shortly after, and here's my bottle, my well-used and loved bottle of Dior Homme. Dior Homme to me takes it in a more overtly masculine direction. A lot of people talk about how this is maybe the first metrosexual perfume because of the powdery iris note. I always found it fairly straightforwardly masculine though, especially in the dry down, which I find sort of classical and woody. But I do believe with these scents, Hedi really established a scented signature, which he continues to this day in the line of fragrances he's created for Celine. For those who don't know or haven't followed his fashion, Eddie Slimane is the type of creative director who just does what he does no matter what brand he's at. Prior to working at Dior, he worked briefly as a new and up-and-coming designer for Yves Saint Laurent. A sort of famous and interesting feud was between him and Tom Ford, who designed the women's wear at Yves Saint Laurent. And apparently Tom did not get along with Yves himself, who was still alive at the time. But Eddie did. Yves gave Eddie his cosign by attending his Saint Laurent and later Dior shows, whereas he would not attend the Tom Ford shows. And I found a funny little quote about Tom Ford. Well, here's Saint Laurent on Tom Ford. "The poor guy does what he can," Saint Laurent told members of the press. And then, "In 13 minutes, you have managed to destroy 40 years of my work." And Tom says, "Even his partner, Pierre Bourget, were so difficult and so evil and made my life such misery." Love the drama. So anyway, Eddie really felt like a true heir, or at least co-signed by Yves himself, to the brand. And after he finished his tenure at Dior, he took a little bit of time off and returned to the scene, designing for Yves Saint Laurent, which he turned into Saint Laurent. And then he left there for a while, moved on to Celine, once again did his heady thing at Celine. He remade the brand in his own image from top to bottom, increased sales by a humongous margin if you look up the sales figures. He's always very good at this. And once again, he's leaving, he's retired. Pretty much every time he retires, it comes out in the press that he was having difficulties in the contract re-signing. I believe he asks for a lot of control. And given the success that he's had at every brand, it's surprising that the CEOs in charge aren't willing to give him that control. So he always ends up leaving when it comes to contract negotiations. At first, when he would jump from brand to brand, people would often complain that he always does the same thing, but I think it's now more or less accepted, as with other iconic fashion designers like a Yohji Yamamoto or a Comme des Garçons, that his style is his style and it doesn't change depending on which brand he goes to. So love it or hate it. The kind of funny thing about it though is that then we had 3 brands in his image. Back to Dior, it's taken a sharp turn into the bland in the last several years. Kim Jones designs the menswear, and while it's elegant and nice, all the things I see in store are just logo-heavy, boring luxury fashion, just capital luxury fashion. Boring polos, boring t-shirts, boring jeans with CD logos all over the place. Because of my disappointment in what followed Eddie, first it was Chris Van Ash who had worked with Eddie, and this was a weird time in Dior, at least Dior Homme. I believe Dior women's wear was still super red hot as Galliano was designing it at the time. But Chris seemed to not know what he wanted to do. He took it down these strange goth vampiric collections, these weird sporty tangents. I kind of don't know what's going on. So for several years, I didn't set foot in a Dior boutique to see what was going on with the fragrances. And one day, to my great surprise, I walked in and there were like 10 or 12 of them. And I thought, what happened? Where did these come from? I wasn't into fragrance enough at the time to follow the change to François Demachy. So I was just like, what has happened to this line? And at that time, I bought Bois d'Argent, which had already changed from this earlier cologne presentation, which does have a screw-off cap, to this magnetic cap. At the time, I was actually pleased because it was cheaper per mil, because I believe this is 125. So I was quite happy to finally pick it up. At the time, I always spent a lot of time deciding on a new fragrance, but I probably bought 1 or 2 per year. So while I was really into picking out an appropriate and good fragrance, I just didn't buy that much that I was paying attention to the changes in the fragrance world. And I had no idea at that time how quick changes could take place. Eau Noire became discontinued. Some of those early fragrances from Demachy that now people quite revere, like Leather Oud, became discontinued as well. I remember a subsequent visit probably 3 years ago to the Dior counter. I was again shocked by the amount of fragrances and how bland they all smelled. I've been kind of a real detractor of Demachy, but now it's starting to look like maybe what he did was interesting compared to what Francis had done. But I gotta say, it's like sports. This negativity isn't really geared towards the man himself. You might hate a sports manager who changed the team. It's just that he changed a collection that I thought was so artful and so great into something really unrecognizable to me. But that's fashion. Creative directors change all the time. Houses change their style on a dime, unless you're Chanel. And we've just got to live with that. So back to these few fragrances. As you can see, I do have the silver stem, and I'm quite sure this must be the very first release because I was such a fan. I ran out to buy Dior Homme the moment it came out. Unfortunately, this bottle has gone a bit off, as you can see by the tiny amount of juice in there, but I'll spray it anyway, just for a little interesting comparison. This was really my scent of college, and this one's a little bit stuck in time. I find that Bois d'Argent is not as stuck in time for me. I wore it and I didn't feel like, oh, this is a nostalgia trip, but Dior Homme really is for me. I pretty much wore through this bottle in college. Actually, it still smells great. I tried it a couple years ago and thought maybe the top went off. There was a little funk. Yeah, irisy. I get a lot of bergamot. There's a freshness, there's a coolness. At the time, I didn't really know what iris was, and I remember always thinking that there's this clay-like feeling to it. I don't get powdery iris to me. I do get makeup in the way that a lipstick sort of has a clay-like texture, but I always found this really interesting, intoxicating texture that's given by the iris that I didn't know what it was at the time, but that's what drew me so much to this perfume. Now I have backed this boy up twice with the black stem here when I heard that the new Dior Homme, the 2020, was replacing this. Now this is still available as Dior Homme Original, not in the US, but I have seen it show up now on Fragbuy, so go out and get it. As often is the case, I feared all the cries of reformulation, which prevented me from even bothering trying a new bottle for quite some time. And then when I finally did buy the bottle and smelled it, I thought, well, what's all the fuss is about? This is Dior Homme. It's that smell I remember. It's exactly that. Smelling it right now off the strip, I do get less iris, and it does smell a little bit lighter and a little bit fresher. Yeah, this is like 1 or 2 notches darker. That could very much be purely due to the age of this and that small amount of juice concentrating the scent a bit. But I will say I have no complaints. I've worn this new version, and I think as long as you don't do a side-by-side, you're not going to notice much difference. If it's something you remember from the past and then several years later you revisit it, for me it was the same experience. It brought me right back. So Dior Homme is a modern classic. It makes me love everything Olivier Polge has done. It's an icon. I really think it's a crime that they replaced it with something so boring in 2020. I'm happy they kept it as Dior Original, but it just makes no sense to me that they didn't just leave it alone and release something with a new name, because it's just confusing to the average consumer. So yeah, a classic, a work of art, a sign of its times. Yeah, this one's getting better already as it dries down, as some of the alcohol comes off. Yeah, all very, very similar to me. So again, some personal reminiscence. I'm always reminded of the fashion of that time. I feel like people really started to dress more formally. I wore blazers all the time, skinny blazers and skinny jeans. And I went out to the club, and my favorite night out was a party called Misshapes in New York City. If anybody's heard of this, it's kind of, I feel like it was like really sign of the times, the 2000s. The internet and social media was new-ish. There was no Instagram yet. But one of the things they did that kind of made it famous was if you dressed nicely, they would take you into the basement, into this back room, and they would take your photo in that very MySpace kind of angle from above, which is quite hilarious looking back on. And they would post it up on the website, like the looks of the night. And I did indeed get my photo taken several times. But what I really loved about this party, what was so exciting about it for me at the time, is that it was so egalitarian. You didn't get in based on who you were or how much money you spent or how rich you looked. You got in based on your creativity and the outfit you pulled together for that event. I remember me and my friends each week thinking about what we're gonna wear to Miss Shapes that night. And if you were dressed well and if you're a regular, you got in free. I often witnessed the people in front of us getting a door charge, and even more often witnessed groups of tourists who were dressed plainly turned away with the classic doorman line, "Private event tonight." Of course, it never was a private event. And I know this may all sound a bit snobby, but like I say, it wasn't about wealth and it wasn't about really anything else other than creative personal expression via style. And the fact that you could access these sort of rare spaces purely on style was really a liberating and interesting thing for me at the time. Now, much to my disappointment, when the book came out, my picture was not in there, so you can go looking through this and you won't see me, I can tell you that much. But yes, classic Dior Homme style. Look at that bowl cut, the skinny suit. There's Beth Ditto from The Gossip performing. I missed that night because I was sick. Those emo MySpace haircuts. I was so into this at the time. It's quite funny. Patrick Wolf, who's still doing his thing, but a favorite musician of mine. A lot of these people, it's quite interesting, went on to be pretty successful in their space. I remember that guy, always suited up. So 2000s. Oh, there's the guy who started Opening Ceremony, if anybody remembers that, and then went on to design Kenzo, I think. So yeah, it's just like a who's who of the 2000s and the fashion. I remember there was one boy in particular, there's a full Dior Homme head to toe look that would just completely change his look depending on what Eddie had designed that season. He would just come in the full look from hair to clothes, which is, yeah, a little corny. I have always tried to have more personal style, mix and match designers so that I don't look too much like my style is given to me by someone else. But yeah, that's just a little reminiscence of that time, and these smells obviously remind me of that time. So that was a long talk. We'll go back to discussing the fragrances. So now on to Eau Noire. This is related to the party because my best friend who always went out with me, his fragrance was Eau Noire. And in some ways that's what prevents me from loving it to this day, is I just associate it with him so much that it feels like I'm wearing somebody else's skin. So this I will spray. I have apparently the much coveted original release of Eau Noire. Yeah, the opening is so great, and again, takes me right back. Sorry, my camera is shifting here. Slippery phones. Takes me right back to the time when I was going out. It's really spicy. It's really, people mention coffee. I don't think I would get coffee if it hadn't been, insinuated, but once it's said, I can smell it. It's known for its big syrupy immortelle note. I do find when I wear it, smelling it on strip right now, it's not doing this, but when I have worn it, the spice seems to grow stronger and stronger and become a little more foody. It doesn't help that another kind of funny memory is that same friend really loved to make curry chicken at home, and his home always smelled like literal curry, and I just can't disentangle the food curry from the smell of Eau Noire, and sometimes that prevents me from truly loving it. But especially by today's standards, just an incredibly unique fragrance. And of course, this was created by Francis Kirkjohn, probably at the height of his really unique creating powers before he got on to become Mr. Soapy Musky. But much to our delight, Francis re-released all of the originals as an opening gesture when he became the new nose at Dior. I thought this was quite nice because I wonder how many fans are still out there of these fragrances that want to re-release. So it's kind of a shout out to his early work and to the people who still remember that early Dior line of 3 that was curated by Eddie Slimane. So let's compare. I've compared these and worn them already. I will say the biggest difference, maybe I'll just leave it, hopefully my phone doesn't fall. Yeah, it's fresher. Of course, it's all those things we always say when we smell a new fragrance. It's a lot lighter. It's funny they call this cologne. I wonder if that was just at the time to designate that it's for men, because especially in America, any men's fragrance was called cologne. Now that I think we have a better educated public, more people know that cologne is really originally a concentration of a very light perfume. But I don't think the original colognes are a cologne strength at all. So yeah, it does smell streamlined. I wouldn't say shadow of its former self. And in fact, I have to say the newer Eau Noire I find more easy and pleasant to wear. But I think partly for me, I'm not such a nostalgic person. I actually don't want to smell exactly the same way I did 20 years ago. So while I don't want a reformulation to just totally destroy the intent of an original fragrance, I'm sort of not bothered by an update, because it means that I can wear the fragrance again without totally being reminded of myself from 20 years ago. So I feel that way with the new Eau Noire. I still recognize it as Eau Noire, but it's different and updated enough. Yeah, especially as the dry down gets going, I'm smelling more similarity. That spice is starting to come out. It's different enough that I feel like I can wear it now while shedding some of those older associations. Again, the original goes very musty and heavy. I wouldn't say overly syrupy and thick, but just this warm spice just like takes you over. And of course that's very beautiful, but it also makes it a little challenging. It's like having a very heavy, rich meal. It's the kind of thing that once I've worn it, I feel like, okay, time to put it back till next year. Whereas the new Eau Noire, I feel like I could wear several times in a row and not tire of it or feel overwhelmed by it. But it is no doubt much lighter. I think you're gonna have to spray a lot more to get the same effect. But I think it's well done, and it's a respectable re-release, and I appreciate it for what it is, even though what it is not exactly what it was. So that's my video. I hope it wasn't too ranting. I'm sorry about the woozy slipping camera angle, but after 20 minutes, I'm not about to restart. So those are my thoughts on some of the Dior fragrances, and the reason why I don't have a single one from the post-Eddie era. I do think probably now in retrospect, Demeschi has created some pretty nice and interesting fragrances for the line, but I just can't go back there. It's like revisiting an old friend who completely changed and now they're unrecognizable. It just makes you sad. So there we go. I wonder if anybody else remembers those times, if anybody else was in New York City and went to Misshapes. The three behind it were DJs who became quite famous at the time, and I believe some of them are still out there and working. And I know I must be old now because I find the current club scene completely uninteresting. It seems dominated by these humongous ticketed events, and I'm sorry, but I do not buy tickets to go out. I'm not going to a concert. Oh, and that's the last thing I wanted to say. What was so cool about Misshapes, they would often have impromptu concerts by really cool artists like The Gossip, Patrick Wolf. What was that? There was a French band that had a really big hit at the time. So you got to basically see, again, if you got in free, a free concert. And I just love that nightlife. I've never been a drinker. I've never done any drugs. So for me, I want to go out to a club and be entertained, either with good music to dance to. I don't go to the club to get messed up and drunk. To me, that's not really fun. It lacks imagination. I used to always say to my friends who would give me a hard time for not drinking, if the club is so boring that you have to be drunk to enjoy it, then there's a problem with the club. So those are some of my thoughts on clubbing, the 2000s, Dior Homme and Eddie Slimane. I hope he doesn't leave fashion for good. It sounds like he might be going to Chanel. Back in the day, he was sort of anointed as the heir to Carl because Carl loved Eddie so much and Eddie's design so much. So we'll see what happens. But grab your Celine bottles now if you're a fan.